Hello, this presentation is about a pilot study on the role of task-induced involvement in ESL vocabulary acquisition through online listening and speaking activities. The involvement load hypothesis was proposed by Laufer and Holstein in 2001. They hypothesized that higher task involvement would lead to more vocabulary acquisition, and possible reasons for that could be the role of attention and noticing or the role of depth of processing. And they divided involvement into three components, which were need, search, and evaluation. And each of these components could be classified as moderate or strong. So if the need for the word was based on external motivation, then need was categorized as moderate. If the need for a word was based on intrinsic motivation, then it was classified as a strong need. In the search category, which is trying to find the meaning of a word, in the initial hypothesis, it wasn't subdivided as moderate or strong, but the distinction was added later. So searching is considered moderate if the learner is just searching for the meaning of a new word. It's considered strong if the learner is searching for another word that expresses a similar meaning. And evaluation is comparing multiple meanings of a word or comparing a word with other words. So it is considered moderate if learners can identify the differences between multiple meanings of one word or the differences between multiple words. And it's considered strong if learners produce an utterance using the word in the context of other words. So to calculate the involvement load score, a score of 0 is assigned for each missing component of involvement, and 1 for each moderate level of each component of involvement, and 2 for each strong level of involvement. So the score for need, search, and evaluation is added together to get a total involvement score. And if the hypothesis is correct, then higher levels of involvement would lead to more vocabulary acquisition. There have been many previous studies on the involvement load hypothesis, but I'm just going to highlight two very prominent studies. The first one I'm going to discuss is Holstein and Laufer's 2001 study. So they had two groups of learners in different locations, and they subdivided them into three smaller groups. The first group had a reading comprehension task, which would have a low involvement level. The second group had a reading comprehension task with a vocabulary fill-in-the-blank exercise, which had a higher level of involvement. And then the third group had a composition task, which was the highest level of involvement. So in the two different locations, three groups did these tasks. And then they gave them an immediate post-test and a delayed post-test. And participants translated or described the meaning of target words and indicated whether or not they knew them before performing the task. The results show that the learners in the composition group had the best vocabulary retention on the post-tests and the delayed post-tests, followed by the learners in the fill-in-the-blank groups, and finally followed by the comprehension question groups. And this is exactly what they would have expected based on the involvement load hypothesis. In one of the settings, there was a significant difference between the retention scores for all the task groups, but in the other setting, there was only a significant difference in the retention scores of the composition group. Dr. Eugene Kim's 2008 study also reports two experiments on the involvement load hypothesis. The first experiment was a partial replication of Holstein and Laufer's 2001 experiment. So just like the previous one, it had three tasks. One was a reading comprehension task with low involvement. One was a reading comprehension task with fill-in-the-blank questions that was medium involvement. And then there was a composition task with higher involvement. And she gave them immediate and delayed post-tests based on the Parry-Bachtin-Welsh vocabulary knowledge scale. And the results were that on the immediate post-test, the tasks that had higher involvement led to more initial vocabulary knowledge. And there was a significant difference on the writing tasks, but there wasn't a significant difference between the other two tasks. And this was similar to what happened in one of the two groups in Holston and Laufer's 2001 experiment. On the delayed post-test, the greater involvement led to more long-term vocabulary retention, and all three groups had significantly different vocabulary retention. For the second experiment, she wanted to test a claim that Laufer had made in 2005 that writing sentences and writing essays had the same level of involvement. So she wanted to test if a sentence writing task would lead to the same amount of vocabulary acquisition as a composition task. And she found that they actually did. The composition group and the sentence writing group had similar initial and delayed vocabulary retention. The current pilot study is a partial replication of Kim's 2008 studies. The methods are based on her Experiment 1 methods, but there are a few changes that were made to fit the learning context of the participants. One of the big changes is that the reading and listening tasks that Dr. Kim used were converted into listening and speaking tasks because the participants were in a course that focused on listening and speaking. Another big change was that it was conducted using an online platform. Because of the pandemic, the participants were doing all their classes online at the time of the pilot study, so they did all the tasks on an online platform. These changes were made because of the context, but they also make the pilot study more interesting because it looks at the involvement load hypothesis from a less commonly studied perspective. The research questions were, does the level of involvement in three tasks, listening comprehension, fill-in-the-blank listening, and speaking tasks, affect ESL students' initial L2 vocabulary acquisition? And does the level of involvement in three tasks, listening comprehension, fill-in-the-blank listening, and speaking tasks, affect ESL students' retention of L2 vocabulary? The participants were in a course that I was teaching. It was in an intensive English program class at a university level, and the students were in level 4 out of 5 in the program that they were in. The course had a news theme, and it focused on speaking and pronunciation and listening, and there were 22 students in the course, but only 9 of them ended up participating, and participant attrition is going to be discussed later. And the first languages of the students who participated were French, Arabic, Mandarin, Spanish, and Vietnamese. The first step was choosing target vocabulary words. So to make sure that they were words that the learners didn't already know, a pretest was given to them. And 40 words were selected for the pretest, looking at the academic word list, because the students were in a program that focused on academic English, so I wanted to pick words that would be useful for them. So 40 words that I thought they wouldn't be likely to know were selected, and if the words commonly came with prepositions or other words, then those were included. So there were some multi-word units that were derived from the words on the AWL list and the pretest. So the students took the pretest, and it was based on Paribachton-Welsh's vocabulary knowledge scale test. So after they took the pretest, the 10 words that they knew the least were selected for the tasks. So the words that were albeit, alter, bond with, bulk, clue as to, denote, discrete, offset, overlap with, and synthesis. So after the vocabulary was selected, the students were given tasks. There were 3 groups, and each group had a different task. And then there was an immediate post-test and a delayed post-test. The delayed post-test was approximately 1 week later, but since it was delivered online, not everybody took it on the same day. Here are some screenshots from one of the tests that was based on Paribachton-Welsh's vocabulary knowledge scale test. So the top screenshot is the directions that the students were given. It says, rate the following words on a scale of 1 to 4 based on how familiar they are to you. If you choose 3, provide a definition or synonym. If you choose 4, use the word in the sentence and provide a definition or synonym. So then the students would look at the word and they would either choose 1, I don't know this word, what this word means, 2, I've seen this word before, I think it means, and then they would fill in the gap. And then 3, I know this word, I can give a definition or synonym. And 4, I can use it in a sentence, and they would write a sentence with the word. The benefit of this kind of test is that you can look at different degrees of knowing the word, from a little bit of familiarity and maybe being able to guess, to being able to know it and being able to use it in a sentence. It can also show the development if learners go from one number to the next. Maybe they start out being a little bit familiar and then they are able to provide a definition later. So it's a nice test to use because you can see different degrees of knowledge of a word. The bottom screenshot is an example of what the students would see. So you have the word at the top, and then they would either choose 1, I don't know the word, 2, I've seen the word before, I think it means, and then they're supposed to provide what they think it means. And then 3, I know the word it means, and they provide the definition or synonym. And 4, I can use it in a sentence, and they write the sentence. And if they choose 4, they're supposed to also do 3 to give the definition. When scoring a vocabulary knowledge scale test based on Parr-Welsh's model, if the learner chose 1 and they're not familiar with the word, you give them a score of 1 for that word. If they chose 2 that they perceive it as familiar, you give them a score of 2. And if they choose 3 and they give a correct definition or synonym, then you give them 3. If they chose an incorrect definition or synonym, then you give them 2 because they thought that they were familiar with it, but they guessed wrong. If the learner chose 4, they claim to know the word and a correct synonym or definition is provided, and they give an example sentence. If the word in the example sentence fits in terms of context and meaning, but it's not really grammatically correct, then you give them a score of 4. If the meaning and the grammar is correct in the sentence as provided, then you give them a score of 5. The task for the first group was a listening comprehension task, and the listening input was a news report containing all the target vocabulary items about voter participation in a country that doesn't exist. And this was, of course, was not a real news report. It was just manufactured for the task so that all the target vocabulary could be included and it could be at an appropriate level. And the topic was chosen because of the course theme about news, and they had been listening to news about the primary elections and stuff, so that's why the voter participation topic was chosen. So the intent was to make it go with the curriculum and go with what they had been learning and not be too difficult that they wouldn't understand it. And the students listened to the story while they were looking at a list of the target vocabulary words with definitions. And the reason for providing them the words with the definition was to make sure that the search score was 0. And then the students completed true or false listening comprehension questions after listening. So the task involvement load for this activity is 1. The motivation to know the vocabulary is external. They just need to know it for the task. So the need is moderate. So it gets a score of 1. There's no searching because the definitions are provided for them. So the search is 0. And there's no evaluation. They don't need to compare meanings of the word or compare the words. So the evaluation is 0. So this is the lowest level of involvement. This is a screenshot of what it looked like on the platform. So they would hear the story, and then they had all the target vocabulary with definitions on the same page where they were hearing the story. And this is a screenshot of one of the pages with the comprehension questions that came after the listening. For the second task, the idea of a fill-in-the-blank exercise was transformed from a reading-writing activity to a listening activity. So the same story that the students in Task 1 listened to was also used for the students in Task 2, but the target vocabulary items were replaced by a piano tone. So students would listen one sentence at a time, or if there were a few sentences in a row without a target vocabulary word, they'd hear those few sentences together with the next sentence containing a target vocabulary item. And the target vocabulary items would be replaced by a piano tone. So for example, a sentence in the story was a study on voter participation this year, conducted by Laura Brown, a political science professor, might provide a clue as to why people are not coming out to vote. The target vocabulary phrase was clue as to. So what the participants doing task 2 would hear was a study on voter participation this year, conducted by Laura Brown, a political science professor, might provide a why people are not coming out to vote. So then the students would look at a list of options for which word to replace with the piano tone with. And the options they were given were all the target vocabulary items and a few distractor words. I'll show you a screenshot of what one of the questions would look like. So they would just have the audio at the top, it wasn't written, and they have the list of terms, and then they have the list of possible choices to replace the piano note. The students in the third group did a speaking task. So the directions were to set a timer for 15 minutes, record yourself speaking about what you know about elections in the United States or another country, and do not spend more than 15 minutes planning and recording, 10 minutes to plan and 5 minutes to record, and use the following terms in your response. And they're given all the terms with the definition. So the need for this task is one, because the motivation to know the vocabulary is external. The search is 0 because definitions are provided. And evaluation is 2 because it's strong. It requires evaluating how to use the words in the context of sentences by themselves. So this task had a higher level of involvement than the other two tasks. So just to summarize the involvement load of all the tasks, the first task that was just listening comprehension questions had an involvement load score of 1. The second task that had gap fill and comprehension questions had an involvement load score of 2. And the third task that was a speaking task had an involvement load score of 3. And the involvement load score was manipulated using the evaluation criteria, and the need and the search stayed the same for all 3 tasks. Now I'll go through some of the results of the pilot study, but there are some very important limitations to consider, so if you end the video early, make sure that you fast forward to the limitations section before you finish watching it. These are the pre-test scores for the target vocabulary that was selected, and remember that the scale ranges from 1 to 5. 1 being that they don't know the word, 5 being that they know it and they use it correctly grammatically and semantically, and 3 is kind of the cutoff for being able to at least define the word. So all of these words had an average pre-test score that was below 3. The sample size was not large enough to have any relevant statistics, but from the limited group that we had, group 3 had the highest task involvement level and it had the highest immediate post-test gains, followed by group 1 with the lowest task-induced involvement level. On the delayed post-test, the groups with higher levels of task involvement displayed more vocabulary gains, which is what would have been expected. And again, just keep in mind these are very small sample sizes. In all three groups, most of the participants had an increased number of target vocabulary receiving a score of 3 or above after completing the assigned task, suggesting that regardless of the involvement load, the tasks were to some extent effective in increasing the students' vocabulary knowledge. But again, for this very small group, it's not good to draw generalizations. And then there was only one student who did not increase the amount of vocabulary, receiving a score of 3 or above after completing the assigned task, and another student who displayed a decrease in the amount of vocabulary, receiving a score of 3 or above on the immediate post-test, and an increase in the amount of vocabulary, receiving a score of 3 or above on the delayed post-test. So that's a curious case. And this is a table summarizing the average scores for the pre-test, immediate post-test, and delayed post-test for each group. And the reason that the sample sizes are not equal is because of participant attrition. And you can see that in group 1, there was a participant who took the delayed post-test, but not the immediate post-test. And then in group 2, you can see that some participants took the immediate post-test, but not the delayed post-test, and in group 3 as well. The class was initially divided into roughly equal groups for 1, 2, and 3, but of course not everybody participated. So this is how it ended up. If you recall, on the VKS test, a score of 3 indicates that students could provide a correct definition of the word. So this chart summarizes the increase in the number of words that got at least a 3 or above. So for group 1 on the pretest, only 3 of the target words got 3 or above. But then on the immediate post-test, 7 words got 3 or above, and on the delayed post-test, 6 words got 3 or above. For group 2, on the pretest, only 1 word got 3 or above. On the immediate post-test, 2 words got 3 or above, and on the delayed post-test, 7 words got 3 or above. And of course, it's not expected that there would be more on the delayed. It's actually expected that they might forget a little bit after a while, so this is a bit surprising. And then in group 3, an average of 1.667 words got 3 or above on the pretest, and then on the immediate post-test, 9.333, and on the delayed post-test, 10 words got 3 or above. And again, these are the averages for each group. The chart shows how each participant improved or didn't improve on their knowledge of each of the words. So to calculate their vocabulary gain, their score on the pretest for each word was subtracted from their score on the post-test of the word. So the darker red region shows their gains on the post-test, and the lighter red region shows their gains on the delayed post-test. And if the rows that say NA means that the student didn't take that test. So you can see the first participant, for example, didn't take the immediate post-test, but then they took the delayed post-test. There were a lot of cases, surprisingly, of students who actually took the pretest after the task intervention. And of course, that data couldn't be used because then we can't calculate whether or not the task was helping them improve their vocabulary, because the whole point of the pretest score is to see whether or not they knew it in the beginning. So those ones were excluded, and that's part of the reason why the number of participants is so small. But if you're interested in the numbers, you can pause the video and look at the chart. So there are some important limitations to consider, and as mentioned, the sample size is a very big limitation. This is a small-scale pilot study, so it should not be used to draw generalizations. And as mentioned before, the part of the reason for the small sample size was some students took the pretest after the task. When this was initially planned to be in person, the idea was one day I would give the students the pretest, then another day I would give them the task, and the delayed in the post-test, and then another day give them the delayed post-test. But since this was all online, it was one day I put the pre-test online and asked them to do it, and then another day I put the task online with the immediate post-test and asked them to do it, and then another day put the delayed post-test online. But since everything stays online, it's possible for them to do it late, and so students who were completing the steps late, some of them did it out of order. So that's something to consider if doing a larger scale study. It would be better to make sure that the platform doesn't let that happen. And then of course some students took only one of the post tests. And of course some students chose not to participate, and that's fine. And another limitation was limited ability to monitor students in the online platform. A program called Lockdown Browser was used. It prevents students from accessing any websites while they have a test open. So it was used during both the delayed post-test and the immediate post-test. However, this program has a limitation because it only logs the device that they're taking the test on, but of course it can't do anything about other devices that might be around them. And there weren't any cameras used in this study because I didn't want to invade on the participants' privacy, but they were told that it's not for a grade to take away any incentive of cheating. There were some cases of very good performance that I was suspicious about, but I didn't find any actual evidence of cheating. So there's no way to know. So if this is done on a larger scale, maybe some better proctoring strategies should be implemented. So, in an in-person environment, whoever is facilitating the test would just watch what's going on. But of course, in an online environment, maybe we have to be more innovative and think about ways to do that. And of course, make sure that it's very clear to the participants that a bad score is not going to hurt them in any way. Another limitation is that task 1 and 2 may have been more difficult for the students than intended. It was designed trying to make it easy for them, but a lot of students actually had trouble with the comprehension questions, indicating that it may have been more difficult than what was intended. So careful task design is an important step. So based on the limitations and challenges in this small-scale pilot study, I have a list of suggestions for a larger project. And one of the suggestions would be to have stricter controls for proficiency. If this were done on a large scale, it would be good to give everyone a proficiency test just to make sure that proficiency level isn't a confounding variable. In this case, for the smaller scale project, the controls for proficiency was very loose, that they were all in the same level in their program, but it had been a while since they had taken a placement test. So this is not a sufficient control for proficiency. So for a larger scale study, it would be better to actually test them. I just didn't want to take extra time from the participants for the small scale study. So these are the suggestions for the future. And of course, the biggest suggestion would be to have more participants. If you're interested in reading any of the references, feel free to pause the video and copy down any references that you're interested in. I would definitely recommend the Holstein and Laufer 2001 study and the Kim 2008 study. If you're interested in just general information about what the involvement hypothesis is, the Laufer 2016 paper is good. It describes involvement and also some other things. If you're interested in the vocabulary knowledge scale test, you can look at the Paribach and Wesch paper. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the question and answer session. I hope you enjoyed it. I appreciate your attention.